Sometimes the most broken things carry the most hope. Sometimes an old man and a limping donkey can teach a town what worth means. When 58-year-old widower Eli Cade walks into a dusty livestock auction, he's not looking for hope. Then he sees her, a ragged, beaten-down donkey everyone calls worthless. But something in that animal's tired eyes speaks to the weariness in his soul. Against the crowd's mockery, Eli buys the donkey for nothing and names her Grace. What starts as one broken soul helping another becomes something neither expected. As Eli nurses Grace back to health, their quiet bond becomes a rebellion against a world that wrote them off. Can two discarded lives really find their way back to meaning? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Eli Cade's weathered front porch, highlighting every crack and split in the wood that he no longer bothered to repair. He sat in the same rocking chair he'd occupied every dawn for the past 2 years, a cup of black coffee growing cold in his weathered hands. The chair beside him, Martha's chair, remained empty, its green cushions faded from seasons of neglect and mountain weather. Eli twisted the gold wedding band on his ring finger, a habit that had worn the metal smooth over the months since Martha's death. 28 years of marriage, and he still couldn't bring himself to remove it. Martha used to tease him about his thick fingers, how the ring looked too delicate for hands that could wrestle a 2,000-pound bull or mend fence posts in a blizzard. Now those same hands seemed smaller somehow, diminished by grief and the absence of purpose that had once driven every waking. The Cade Ranch had once been the pride of Cedar. 300 acres of prime, grazing land nestled against the foothills of the Rockies, where the grass grew thick and sweet and the water ran clear from mountain springs that had never failed, even in the worst drought years. Eli's grandfather had homesteaded this land in 1902, arriving with nothing but determination and a belief that hard work could transform wilderness into something that mattered. 3 generations of Cades had built it into a legacy that felt permanent, weathering market crashes and harsh winters, droughts that broke lesser men, and economic changes that swept away neighbors who couldn't adapt. But that was before the cancer came calling like a thief in the night, stealing Martha away piece by piece over 18 months that felt like both an eternity and a heartbeat. Before the medical bills that forced him to sell off the cattle first, then the horses that had been Martha's special joy, then parcels of land to developers who saw profit margins where he saw family legacy. Before his daughter Sarah packed her grief into a U-Haul truck and disappeared to Denver, leaving behind nothing but silence and a phone number she rarely answered. The main house sat empty now, its windows boarded up like closed eyes that had seen too much sorrow. Eli had moved into what used to be the foreman's cabin, a one-room structure that felt more like a monk's cell than a home. It held the basic necessities: a narrow bed that felt too wide for one person, a wood-burning stove that heated the space efficiently but couldn't warm the emptiness, a table for 2 that now seated only 1, and shelves lined with books that Martha had loved and he could no longer bear to read. Her romance novels sat beside his ranch management guides, their spines touching like old friends who had run out of things to say to each other. The town of Cedar Falls had shrunk along with Eli's world. Economic decline and demographic change slowly draining the life from what had once been a thriving agricultural community. What had been home to nearly 2,000 souls in its heyday had dwindled to fewer than 800, and many of those were retirees from Denver or California who'd moved to the mountains for the scenery but had little connection to the land or the values that had built the community. Main Street bore the visible scars of economic decline, empty storefronts with "for lease" signs that had grown dusty with age, a bank that had closed its doors 3 years ago when the last independent operation was absorbed by a Denver conglomerate, and Martha's Cafe that served as the town's unofficial courthouse, where verdicts on neighbors' lives were rendered over coffee and pie. Betty Kowalski, The cafe's owner and operator had inherited the place from her parents and served as the town's unofficial mother confessor, gossip clearinghouse, and keeper of secrets that went back decades. She was 65, widowed herself for 8 years, and possessed the kind of intuitive understanding of human nature that made her both beloved and slightly feared by the community's residents. The cafe's red vinyl booths had witnessed marriage proposals and divorce papers, cattle deals and funeral arrangements, the small dramas and larger tragedies that made up the fabric of rural life. Eli's daily routine had calcified into a ritual of avoidance that kept him moving without requiring him to actually live. Rise at 5:30, the same time he'd gotten up for 40 years of ranching. Coffee on the porch until 7, watching the sun climb over mountains that had once framed his empire but now felt like walls of a prison. Check the empty pastures that he no longer had animals to fill, walking fence lines more from habit than necessity. Drive the 15 minutes to town for supplies he didn't really need. Groceries for one person that felt like an admission of defeat every time he pushed the cart through aisles designed for families. Nod politely at neighbors who looked at him with the particular mixture of pity and discomfort reserved for the grieving, their eyes sliding away from his face as if grief might be contagious. Return home to eat meals that tasted like cardboard and watch television programs that Martha used to enjoy, her absence filling the room like smoke that couldn't be cleared. No matter how many windows he opened, the phone calls from Sarah had dwindled from weekly conversations to monthly check-ins to holiday obligations. That felt more painful than the silence they interrupted. Each conversation followed the same script, as predictable as a liturgy neither of them believed in anymore. "How are you doing, Dad?" "Fine, sweetheart, just fine." "Are you eating enough?" "Yes, don't worry about me." "Are you getting out, seeing people?" "Some, when I need to." "You should come visit Denver, see the city. Maybe we could take a trip somewhere." "Maybe, baby girl, maybe soon." But they both knew he wouldn't leave the ranch, and she wouldn't come home to face the memories that lived in every room and field and fence post. Sarah had always been Martha's daughter in temperament, quick with words, passionate about causes that extended beyond the ranch's boundaries, dreaming of lives bigger than cattle prices and hay yields and the endless cycle of seasons that defined rural existence. She'd graduated summa cum laude from Colorado State with a degree in environmental science, landed a prestigious job with a conservation group, bought a loft apartment in Denver's trendy Lodo district that cost more per month than most people in Cedar Falls made in 3 months. She sent pictures sometimes, Sarah at office parties, surrounded by young professionals who looked like they'd stepped out of magazine advertisements. Sarah hiking 14ers with friends, whose names Eli couldn't keep straight and whose faces blurred together in a collage of urban sophistication and accomplishment. The distance between them had started before Martha's death, growing from the inevitable drift between a rancher's daughter and the wider world she'd discovered in college. But grief had widened that gap into a chasm that neither seemed able or willing to bridge. They loved each other, Eli had no doubt about that. Fundamental truth, but love alone couldn't span the silence that had settled between them like dust on everything else in his life that had once mattered. The county fairgrounds buzzed with the familiar energy of auction day, a mixture of serious business and social ritual that had remained unchanged for generations. Farmers and ranchers from 3 counties gathered on the first Saturday of each month to buy and sell everything from livestock to equipment, conducting the kind of commerce that had built the agricultural economy of the Mountain West. Eli parked his truck at the edge of the gravel lot, far from the clusters of ranchers and dealers who gathered around tailgates to drink coffee from dented thermos bottles and trade gossip about cattle prices, weather patterns, and the federal regulations that seemed designed to make their lives more complicated. He'd once been part of those circles, his opinions sought on breeding stock and pasture management, his presence expected at every sale because the Cade Ranch had been a bellwether for the region's agricultural health. Other ranchers had watched what Eli bought and sold, using his decisions as a barometer for market trends and seasonal strategies. Now he felt like a ghost haunting his former life, recognized but no longer relevant, remembered but no longer consulted. The auction barn itself was a cavernous metal structure that smelled of sawdust, diesel fuel, and decades of livestock. A mixture that had once meant home and purpose, but now felt like visiting a museum of his own past. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the concrete floors, where sellers displayed their wares with the pride and desperation that characterized small-scale agriculture in an increasingly corporate world. Most of the morning would be dedicated to equipment sales, tractors with more hours on them than their sellers cared to admit. Hay balers held together by prayer and baling wire, fence posts and gates, and the accumulated detritus of agricultural life that outlasted the farms and ranches where it had once been essential. Eli moved through the displays with practiced efficiency, examining used equipment with the critical eye of someone who'd learned to spot quality beneath layers of rust and neglect. A John Deere hay rake caught his attention, an older model, but well-maintained, priced fairly for what it was worth. He made a mental note and continued his circuit, hands clasped behind his back in the posture of a man shopping without enthusiasm or real need. The rake would serve to maintain the appearance that he was still in the business of ranching. Even though he had no hay to rake and no cattle to feed, the livestock portion wouldn't begin until afternoon. But Eli found himself staying despite having no real business with animals he couldn't afford to buy and had no place to keep. Perhaps it was simply the alternative, returning to an empty cabin where silence waited like an unwelcome guest. Or maybe it was the faint hope that being around life, even life destined for other people's purposes, might somehow remind him what it felt like to care about something beyond mere survival. The livestock barn adjoined the equipment building, separated by a covered walkway that offered protection from the mountain weather that could change without warning from sunshine to snow squalls, even in late summer. Here the atmosphere was different, more primal somehow, as animals and humans engaged in the ancient ritual of commerce that reduced living creatures to pounds and breeding potential and market value. Eli found a seat in the bleachers, high enough to observe without participating in the social dynamics that played out below. He recognized most of the regular buyers, cattle dealers from the valley who bought in bulk and shipped to feedlots, hobby farmers from the Denver suburbs looking for animals to grace their gentleman ranches, and the handful of remaining serious ranchers who still made their living from the land rather than from selling it to developers. The first lots went quickly, prime breeding cattle that commanded top dollar from buyers who understood genetics and bloodlines, horses with papers and proven performance records that would find homes with serious riders, a collection of sheep that drew competitive bidding from the ethnic communities in the area who prized them for religious holidays and family celebrations. Eli watched with the detached interest of someone who no longer had skin in the game, noting prices more from habit than need, remembering when such decisions had mattered to his own operation. It was nearly 3 o'clock when they brought out what the auctioneer euphemistically called the rough stock, the animals that didn't fit neatly into premium categories, the old, the injured, the unwanted creatures whose only crime had been to outlive their usefulness to humans who measured worth in dollars and production capacity. A lame gelding with a kind eye drew modest interest from someone looking for a companion animal for their children. A trio of goats, missing various appendages to predators, found homes with a petting zoo operator from Grand Junction who seemed genuinely concerned about their welfare. And then Billy Patterson's voice cut through the afternoon heat with words that made Eli's chest tighten with unexpected recognition. "Next up, we've got Lot 47, folks. Now, I'll be honest with you, this little Jenny's seen better days." They led her into the ring with a makeshift halter cobbled together from frayed rope and what looked like baling wire. the kind of improvised restraint that spoke of owners who'd stopped caring enough to invest in proper equipment. The donkey was small, even by donkey standards, her coat a patchwork of grey and brown that might have been beautiful if it hadn't been dulled by malnutrition and the kind of neglect that came from being forgotten rather than actively mistreated. But it was her movement that caught Eli's attention and held it, a pronounced limp in her left rear leg that spoke of old injury poorly healed, the kind of damage that came from being worked despite pain or simply ignored until what might have been treatable became permanent. Her ribs showed clearly beneath her rough coat, and her hooves were overgrown and cracked from lack of proper care, the kind of maintenance that took time and attention that apparently no one had been willing to provide. Someone had painted a number on her hip in bright orange paint, 47, as if reducing her to a catalogue entry might somehow disguise the fact that she was a living creature whose only crime had been to outlive her usefulness to the humans who'd owned her. The paint was fresh, applied that morning with the casual efficiency of people preparing unwanted merchandise for disposal. She's got some years on her. And that leg's always going to be gimpy, Billy continued, his voice taking on the practiced neutrality that auctioneers used when selling animals everyone knew were destined for slaughter, or worse. But she's sound otherwise, and donkeys make good guard animals for those of you running sheep or goats. They're smart, they're loyal, and they'll fight off predators that would scatter a whole herd. From his position in the bleachers, Eli could see the crowd's reaction with painful clarity. A few people chuckled at Billy's optimistic description, the kind of polite laughter that acknowledged effort while dismissing substance. Others shook their heads with the dismissive gestures reserved for things they considered beyond saving or not worth the trouble. Most simply ignored the proceedings entirely, engaged in conversations about more promising lots to come, or counting money for animals they actually wanted to buy. The donkey stood in the center of the ring. Her weight shifted to favor her good legs, her head lowered in what might have been defeat or simply exhaustion from the stress of being moved and handled by strangers. The orange number on her hip seemed to glow under the harsh fluorescent lights, a beacon marking her as unwanted merchandise in a market that had no use for broken things. "What am I bid for this, Jenny?" Billy called, his voice carrying less conviction than it had for the premium lots that had preceded her. "She's broke to lead, good with children, just looking for a good home to live out her golden years." "Who'll start me at $50? Silence stretched across the barn like a held breath, the kind of uncomfortable quiet that settled over crowds when they were witnessing something they'd rather not see. Eli found himself leaning forward, studying the donkey's face with an intensity that surprised him. Her eyes were dark and intelligent, framed by lashes that would have been comical in any other context. But there was something else in those eyes, a weariness that seemed to echo the feeling that had taken up permanent residence in his own chest, a recognition of abandonment that spoke to something deep in his own experience of loss. "Come on, folks," Billy tried again, his voice carrying a note of desperation that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else than trying to sell an animal everyone could see was past her prime. "What am I bid?" $40 to start. This little lady's got good years left in her." Someone in the front row snorted with laughter, the sound carrying clearly in the acoustic space designed to amplify voices and sounds. $40 for that bag of bones? "Billy, you trying to finance a new truck with fantasy prices?" More laughter rippled through the crowd, the cruel kind that people indulge in when they feel superior to whatever they're observing. When someone else's misfortune becomes entertainment for those who consider themselves safely removed from similar circumstances. Eli felt something twist in his gut, a familiar anger that he'd thought he'd lost along with everything else that used to matter to him. The bidding dropped to $30, then $25, then $15, each reduction in price accompanied by longer stretches of silence that made it clear no one in the barn considered the donkey worth even minimal investment. Billy's professional smile grew more strained with each failed attempt to generate interest. and Eli could see sweat beading on the auctioneer's forehead despite the afternoon's cooling temperature. All right, Billy said, his voice now carrying more frustration than hope. $15 then? Who'll give me 15 for this little lady? She'd make a good pet for the grandkids. Teach them responsibility. A man in the front row turned to his companion and spoke loudly enough for the entire crowd to hear. His voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who'd never been in a position to understand what it felt like to be judged worthless. Best thing for that one would be a trip to the rendering plant. Put her out of her misery and make some dog food. At least then she'd serve some purpose. The comment drew nods of agreement from several people nearby. The casual cruelty of those who saw suffering as an inconvenience rather than a tragedy, who measured worth solely in terms of utility and profit. Eli's hands clenched into fists in his lap, the wedding ring pressing into his palm hard enough to leave marks that would last for hours. It was in that moment, watching the donkey stand forgotten in the center of the ring, while humans debated her fate with all the compassion they might show for a broken piece of farm equipment, that Eli saw himself reflected in those dark, intelligent eyes. He saw the weariness of being written off, the exhaustion of being considered beyond saving, the quiet dignity of enduring, indifference with grace that came from having no other choice. The donkey wasn't livestock at all. She was a mirror showing him everything he'd become and everything he was afraid of remaining. She was Lot 47, marked with orange paint and priced for quick disposal, just as he'd become Eli Cade, the widower who'd given up, marked by grief and written off by a community that had run out of patience for his mourning. "I'll take her." The words left his mouth before he'd consciously decided to speak them, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the barn like a blade through fabric. Conversation stopped mid-sentence as heads turned to locate the source of the unexpected bid, faces showing surprise and curiosity about who would want what everyone else had dismissed as worthless. Billy Patterson's face lit up with relief and genuine surprise, the expression of a man who'd been trying to solve an impossible problem and had just been handed an unexpected solution. "We have $15 from the gentleman in Section C. Do I hear 20? Anyone want to bid 20 on this fine Jenny?" But the silence that followed was different now. Not the dismissive quiet of disinterest, but the stunned pause of people trying to process something unexpected. Eli could feel eyes on him, could sense the whispered questions passing through the crowd like ripples in still water. Who was that? Why would Eli Cade want a broken-down donkey? Had grief finally driven him over the edge into the kind of irrational behavior that confirmed what everyone had been whispering about his mental state? "Fair warning at $15, Billy called, giving the crowd one last chance to respond to what was clearly a bargain price for any animal, regardless of condition. When no other bids materialized, he brought his gavel down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo longer than physics should have allowed. "Sold to bidder number 103 for $15. The transaction felt surreal as Eli made his way down from the bleachers through a gauntlet of stairs and whispered conversations. At the payment window, he handed over $15.50, the extra 50 cents representing the buyer's premium that the auction house added to every sale. The clerk, a young woman who'd grown up in Cedar Falls, but whose name escaped him, processed the transaction with the kind of professional courtesy that barely concealed curiosity about what had just transpired. "You'll need to pick her up from Pen 7, she said, handing him a receipt that felt like a commitment he wasn't sure he was ready to honor. "Loading chutes around back if you brought a trailer," loading her into his horse. Trailer took patience and several false starts that tested both his resolve and the donkey's willingness to trust a stranger. She balked at the trailer ramp, clearly associating enclosed spaces with unpleasant experiences, her body language broadcasting fear and reluctance that had been earned through hard experience. But eventually, with quiet persistence and a handful of sweet feed from the auction barn's supply, she stepped inside with the resigned acceptance. of a creature who'd learned that resistance was often more painful than compliance. The drive home was quiet, except for the occasional sound of hooves shifting on the trailer floor behind him, small reminders that he was no longer traveling alone. Eli found himself talking to her through the open sliding window that connected the truck cab to the trailer. A one-sided conversation about the weather and the scenery and the ranch where she'd be living. Words that felt rusty from disuse, but somehow necessary. "We'll call you Grace," he said, as they turned onto the dirt road that led to his property. The decision, coming to him with surprising certainty, seems fitting somehow. Grace under pressure, Grace in difficult circumstances. My Martha always said Grace was something you either had or you didn't. And I think you might have more than your share. As if in response to hearing her new name, the donkey nickered softly, the first sound she'd made since leaving the auction barn. It wasn't much, but it was communication. And communication was the first step toward something that might eventually resemble trust, the small pasture behind Eli's cabin had been intended for Martha's garden during the years when they'd first built the foreman's quarters for the ranch hands they could no longer afford to employ. The fencing was good, 4 rails of treated pine that had weathered to silver gray but remained solid and secure. There was a lean-to shelter that had housed garden tools and lawn equipment in better times, and a water source from the same spring that fed the main house. Once free of the trailer's confines, Grace stood perfectly still in the afternoon sun, her head raised to test the mountain air and survey her new surroundings with the careful attention of an animal that had learned to assess every new situation for potential threats or opportunities. The pasture was small but adequate, with enough grass to supplement hay feeding and sufficient space for a single animal to move around comfortably. Grace allowed herself to be led into the enclosure without resistance, but once the gate closed behind her, she retreated to the far corner and turned to face him, her dark eyes watchful and reserved. The message was clear. She would accept this new arrangement. But trust would be earned in increments measured in days and weeks, not minutes and hours. Eli stood at the fence for a long time, studying this creature he'd impulsively purchased without any clear plan for her care or any real understanding of what he'd committed himself to. She was smaller than he'd realized in the auction ring, probably no more than 11 hands high, with a compact body that spoke of hardy breeding designed for work rather than show. Her coat was rough and dull from poor nutrition, but underneath the neglect he could see evidence of good bone structure and intelligent breeding. The lean-to would provide adequate shelter once he cleaned it out and added fresh bedding. The water system would need to be connected, and he'd need to buy hay and grain and all the supplies that came with animal ownership. But more than the practical considerations, he found himself wondering what he'd really bought for $15. Not just a donkey, but a responsibility, a commitment to another living creature's welfare that extended beyond his own daily survival. Inside the cabin, Eli pulled Martha's veterinary journal from the shelf where it had sat untouched for 2 years, its leather cover worn smooth from handling by someone who'd valued the knowledge it contained. The pages were filled with her careful notes about animal care, home remedies developed through years of experience, and observations about the creatures they'd tended. Together during their years of partnership, Martha had never gone to veterinary school. The nearest program had been too far away and too expensive for a rancher's daughter in the 1970s, but she'd educated herself through experience, mentorship from old Doc Rodriguez, and an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that bordered on the mystical. Neighbors had brought their sick animals to her when professional veterinary care was too expensive or too far away, trusting her gentle hands and infinite patience more than formal credentials. The journal fell open to a section about donkey care, as if Martha's spirit had guided his fingers to the relevant pages. Her handwriting was precise and practical, each entry dated and cross-referenced, with observations about what worked and what didn't. The kind of systematic approach she'd brought to everything, from animal care to household management. Donkeys require patience above all else, one entry read in her familiar script. They are not stubborn, as commonly believed, but cautious. A donkey that balks is a donkey that perceives danger, real or imagined. Trust must be built through consistency, not force. Remember, donkeys have excellent memories and forgive more slowly than horses, but once earned, their loyalty is absolute. Another page detailed the nutritional needs of rescued animals, information that seemed directly relevant to Grace's situation. Gradual refeeding is crucial for malnourished animals. Too much too quickly can cause digestive upset or worse. Start with high-quality hay, small amounts frequently. Add grain slowly, watching for signs of colic or founder. Fresh water always available. Salt block essential for desert-adapted species. Eli found himself smiling as he read, remembering how Martha would disappear into the barn for hours when they had a sick animal, emerging only to report on progress or ask him to help with some procedure that required 4 hands instead of 2. She delivered calves in blizzards, sat up all night with colicky horses, and once spent a week nursing a red-tailed hawk back to health after it flew into their living room window and knocked itself unconscious. "You see the best in everything," he'd told her once. Watching her tend to a stray cat that had showed up half dead from starvation and what looked like deliberate abuse. "I see what could be," she'd replied, her hands gentle as she cleaned the cat's infected wounds with antiseptic that must have stung, but which the animal endured with surprising patience. Most creatures just need someone to believe they're worth saving, even when they've stopped believing it themselves. Now, looking out the cabin window at Grace standing motionless in the corner of the pasture, Eli wondered if Martha's words applied to more than just animals. Perhaps some people needed the same thing, someone to believe they were worth saving, even when they'd stopped believing it themselves. Even when the world had written them off as used up and worthless. He spent the rest of the afternoon preparing for Grace's care with the same methodical approach he'd once brought to ranch management. The lean-to needed thorough cleaning and fresh bedding, which he made from straw left over from the garden mulch Martha had laid down in their final spring together. He filled a water trough from the garden hose and tested an old salt block that had been sitting in the barn, finding it still solid despite its coating of dust and spider webs. For hay, he had to drive to Morrison's feed store in town, enduring Jim Morrison's politely curious questions about his sudden interest in livestock feed, with the kind of vague answers that only increased speculation about his mental state and future plans. But Jim was a businessman first and a gossip second. So he loaded Eli's truck with premium Timothy hay without too much commentary beyond observations about the weather and predictions for cattle prices in the coming months. Evening was approaching by the time Eli carried the first armload of hay to Grace's pasture, the mountains casting long shadows across the valley, and the air taking on the crisp edge that promised frost before morning. Grace watched him from her corner, her ears forward but her body language still guarded, the kind of careful attention that prey animals gave to predators they weren't sure they could trust. He spread the hay near the center of the enclosure, far enough from the fence to give her space, but close enough that she wouldn't have to travel far with her injured leg. The hay was good quality, sweet-smelling timothy that rustled with the dry music of properly cured forage. "This is the good stuff," he told her, patting the hay with hands that remembered the feel of quality feed. "Timothy grown in the Yampa Valley. Martha always said you could tell good hay by its smell, sweet, not dusty or moldy. This ought to suit you just fine." Grace didn't approach while he was in the pasture, but the moment he stepped outside the gate and latched it behind him, she began moving toward the hay with careful, measured steps. Her limp was more pronounced when she walked, but she managed the distance without obvious distress. Her movements economical and calculated to minimize stress on her injured leg, while still allowing her to reach the food. Eli watched from the cabin porch as she lowered her head to sniff the hay with the cautious delicacy of an animal that had learned not to take food for granted. She began eating with slow deliberation, not the desperate urgency of true starvation, but with the measured pace of a creature that couldn't be sure when the next meal might come. The sight of Grace eating sparked another memory of Martha, one of the thousands of small moments that made up a marriage, but which gained weight and significance only after they could never be repeated. "Animals tell you everything you need to know," she'd said, watching a rescued horse gain weight and confidence under their care. "How they eat, how they move, how they hold themselves, it's all communication if you know how to listen. The secret is paying attention to what they're saying instead of what you want to hear." Grace ate steadily, but without desperate haste, which told Eli that while she'd been neglected, she hadn't been actively starved. Her movements were economical, calculated to minimize stress on her injured leg, but she covered the entire pile of hay methodically, suggesting both good appetite and the ingrained caution of an animal that couldn't be sure when the next meal might come. As darkness settled over the ranch with the swift finality of mountain evenings, Eli made one final check on his new charge. Grace had retreated to the lean-to, where she stood with her good side toward the opening, positioned to see anyone approaching while keeping her weight off the injured leg. The arrangement spoke of intelligence and hard-won experience. This was an animal that had learned to manage her limitations while remaining alert to potential threats. "Sleep well." "Grace," Eli said softly, though he didn't approach the shelter where she'd taken refuge. "Tomorrow we'll call Doc Rodriguez and see about getting that leg looked at properly. Martha would have known just what to do, but I'm going to need some professional guidance until I figure out what you need." As he walked back to the cabin, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 years, the satisfaction of a day well spent in service to another living creature. It was a small thing, perhaps, buying a broken-down donkey and providing her with basic care. But it was something, and something was more than the nothing that had filled his days since Martha's death. 3 weeks passed like pages turning in a book Eli was finally willing to read again, each day bringing small revelations about Grace's character and gradual improvements in her physical condition. The donkey's ribs were no longer visible beneath her grey coat, and her eyes had lost the hollow look of chronic hunger that had marked her at the auction. More importantly, she'd begun to show curiosity about her surroundings, investigating the fence posts with careful sniffs and watching Eli's movements with what he chose to interpret as interest rather than mere vigilance. Dr. Rodriguez had made a house call the day after Grace's arrival, his weathered hands gentle as he examined her leg and overall condition with the thorough professionalism that had earned him respect throughout 3 counties. Rodriguez was 72, a small man with silver hair and dark eyes that missed nothing, who'd been practicing veterinary medicine in rural Colorado since before Eli had inherited the ranch from his father. "She's lucky you found her," he'd said after completing his examination, his slight accent adding formal precision to words that carried weight coming from someone with his experience. "Another few months of that kind of neglect, and we'd be having a different conversation entirely. The leg will always be a problem. Old injury that healed wrong. Probably a break that was never properly set, but it's not. Going to get worse if she's not overworked." The veterinarian had prescribed a regimen of anti-inflammatory medication mixed into Grace's grain, regular hoof care to address the damage from months of neglect, and most importantly, time and patience for her emotional recovery from whatever trauma had left her so wary of human contact. "Physical healing is the easy part," he'd explained, packing his instruments back into the battered leather bag that had accompanied him on thousands of house calls over 4 decades. "But this girl's been hurt by people, and that kind of damage takes longer to mend than bones and muscles. She needs to learn that not all humans are going to hurt her, and that takes consistency, patience, and time." Eli's days had acquired a rhythm centered around Grace's needs that felt more natural than anything he'd experienced since Martha's death. Morning feeding at 6:30, fresh water, and a check of the shelter for any problems that might have developed overnight. Then an hour spent simply being present in the pasture, not demanding interaction, just establishing his presence as something benign and consistent in her small world. Afternoons brought grooming sessions where Grace gradually allowed him to brush her coat with Martha's old curry comb. Her initial flinching at every touch slowly giving way to what might have been enjoyment. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Ears that relaxed instead of staying pinned back in defensive posture. Breathing that deepened instead of remaining shallow and quick. Muscles that softened under the brush instead of staying tensed for flight. It was during one of these grooming sessions, 3 weeks after Grace's arrival, that Sarah called, her voice coming through the cell phone with the distorted quality of long distance and longer emotional distance that had characterized their conversations for the past 2 years. "Dad, Betty Kowalski called me. She said you bought a donkey at the auction." Eli paused in his brushing, noting how Grace's ears swiveled toward the phone, as if she understood that this conversation concerned her in some way. "I did. Her name's Grace." A long pause filled the space between Colorado and wherever Sarah was calling from. Her office in Denver, probably, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and view of mountains that she'd chosen to admire from a distance rather than live among. "Dad, are you okay?" "I mean, really okay. Betty said she was pretty rough-looking, and you've never been interested in donkeys before. People are starting to talk, and I'm worried about you." There was worry in Sarah's voice. The kind of careful concern that adult children used when they suspected their parents were making decisions based on loneliness rather than logic. When they feared that grief had finally pushed someone they loved over the edge, into behavior that might be classified as irrational or even dangerous. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Better than I've been in a while, actually." He stroked Grace's neck, feeling the warmth of her through the brush, noting how she no longer flinched when he moved his hand along her coat. "She needed help, and I guess I needed something to help. Sometimes things work out that way. But, Dad, taking care of an animal is a big responsibility. What if she gets sick? What if something happens to you? You're out there all alone, and now you've got this donkey that Betty says might not even be healthy enough to survive." Eli heard the unspoken questions beneath Sarah's words, the fears that she couldn't quite bring herself to voice directly. What if you're losing your grip on reality? What if grief has finally broken something essential in you? What if I have to come back and take care of you the way you're taking care of this animal? "Grace is healing just fine," he said, keeping his voice level despite the sting of his daughter's doubt about his judgment and mental state. "Doc Rodriguez says she'll always have that limp, but otherwise she's sound. And I'm not as helpless as everyone seems to think I am." Another pause, this one filled with the weight of things neither of them was ready to say directly. Sarah had fled Cedar Falls and everything it represented, small-town limitations, economic uncertainty, the kind of life where people knew your business and felt entitled to opinions about your choices. But in fleeing that life, she'd also fled him, and they both knew it. "I just worry about you," Sarah said finally. "Mom's been gone 2 years, and you've barely left the ranch except for necessities. Now you're talking to a donkey like she's family, and people are starting to wonder if you're handling things as well as you claim to be." "Maybe family is what we make it," Eli replied, surprised by his own words and the conviction with which he spoke them. "Your mother understood that. She used to say that love doesn't diminish when you spread it around. It multiplies. The more you give away, the more you have." The silence that followed lasted long enough for Eli to wonder if the call had dropped. But then Sarah's voice returned, smaller somehow, and carrying an edge of the little girl she'd once been before the world had taught her to guard her emotions so carefully. "I miss her too, Dad. Every day. But buying broken animals isn't going to bring her back. And I'm afraid you're setting yourself up for more heartbreak if something happens to that donkey." "No," Eli agreed, watching Grace lower her head to graze, her movements now fluid and confident rather than the careful, guarded steps she'd taken during her first days on the ranch. "But maybe it's not about bringing anything back. Maybe it's about moving forward with what we've got left, finding ways to make that count for something." After the call ended, Eli sat on an overturned bucket in Grace's pasture, his phone silent in his hands and his heart heavy with the familiar weight of communication that clarified nothing and resolved even less. Sarah meant well, but her concern felt like judgment, her love like obligation rather than choice. They'd been talking past each other for 2 years now, ever since Martha's funeral, when grief had driven them apart instead of together, when they'd each retreated into private sorrow instead of finding comfort in shared loss. Word about Grace had spread through Cedar Falls with the efficiency of small-town information networks, where news traveled faster than phone calls, and everyone's business became everyone else's concern, whether invited or not. Betty Kowalski, true to form, had appointed herself the unofficial spokesperson for Eli's mental state and Grace's prospects for survival. Her daily reports from Martha's cafe painting Eli as either a saint rescuing an innocent creature or a lonely old man losing his grip on reality, depending on who was listening, and what their relationship to the Cade family happened to be. Eli Cade's got himself a donkey became the opening line of conversations that ranged from admiring to concerned to outright critical, each telling shaped by the speaker's own fears and prejudices about aging, grief, and what constituted acceptable behavior for a widower in a small mountain community. Some folks thought it was sweet, a widower finding purpose in caring for another lost soul, proof that the human capacity for compassion could survive even devastating loss. Others worried about the precedent it set and whether Eli might start collecting strays, like some kind of rural animal hoarder, his property becoming a magnet for every unwanted creature in the county. The most vocal critic turned out to be Pete Hawkins, whose property bordered the old ranch on the south side, and whose opinions about proper land use had grown more strident since his arrival from Phoenix 5 years earlier. Pete had moved to Colorado from Arizona, trading a profitable contracting business for what he called the simple life, but which seemed to involve a lot of complicated opinions about how his neighbors should manage their affairs and what constituted appropriate rural behavior. That animal's a health hazard, Pete announced during the Tuesday morning coffee clatch at Martha's cafe, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd read extensively about subjects he'd never actually experienced firsthand. Donkeys carry diseases, attract predators. Property values in this area are already struggling without people keeping livestock that should be put down humanely instead of being maintained as expensive pets. Betty Kowalski had apparently defended Eli with the fierce loyalty she reserved for long-time customers and anyone who'd been married to someone she'd genuinely liked. Grace is as healthy as any animal in this county, she'd reportedly said, her voice carrying the edge that warned people they were approaching the limits of her patience. Doc Rodriguez checked her out himself. And if that's not good enough for some people, well, maybe those people should mind their own business and worry about their own property instead of everyone else's. But Pete's complaints had found receptive ears among some of the newer residents, Denver refugees in California, transplants who'd moved to rural Colorado for the scenery and the lower cost of living, but brought with them urban expectations about property maintenance and neighborhood standards. They spoke in code about property values and insurance liability, about health department regulations and county zoning ordinances. But their meaning was clear. Grace represented a kind of rural authenticity that made them uncomfortable, a reminder that their mountain retreats were still working agricultural land where function mattered more than form. The controversy came to a head on a Thursday afternoon when Pete appeared at Eli's gate, his jaw set with the kind of determination that suggested he'd been rehearsing this conversation for days and had finally worked up the courage to have it face to face. Eli, we need to talk about that donkey of yours. Grace was grazing near the fence, close enough to observe the interaction, but far enough away to avoid direct involvement in human drama. She raised her head at Pete's voice, her ears forward and alert to the tension in his tone, her body language broadcasting the kind of weariness that came from hard experience with conflict between humans. What about her? Eli kept his voice neutral. though something in Pete's posture and the aggressive way he'd positioned himself at the gate set his teeth on edge and reminded him of every boundary dispute and neighbor conflict he'd ever dealt with during 40 years of ranching. Look, I get it. You're lonely, you wanted a project, something to keep you busy. But that animal's a liability waiting to happen. What if she gets out? What if she hurts someone? What if she dies on your property and starts attracting buzzards and God knows what else? Some of us moved out here for peace and quiet, not to live next to some kind of rescue operation. Grace had moved closer to the fence during their conversation, drawn perhaps by the intensity of their voices, or maybe just curious about the human drama playing out in her vicinity. She stood near Eli's elbow, close enough that he could feel her warmth and draw comfort from her presence, and he found her proximity oddly steadying in the face of Pete's barely controlled hostility. "Grace isn't going anywhere," Eli said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of finality that came from decisions made not in anger, but from deep conviction. "This is her home now, and anyone who has a problem with that is welcome to take it up with me directly instead of spreading gossip around town." Pete's face flushed red above his carefully trimmed beard, the color deepening as he realized that his diplomatic approach had failed to achieve the results he'd been expecting. "We'll see about that. There are channels for dealing with situations like this, legal remedies for people who won't be reasonable neighbors. Property values, health codes, zoning restrictions. There are ways to handle people who think they can do whatever they want without considering the impact on the community." After Pete left, driving away in his expensive pickup truck with more force than the gravel road required, Eli stood at the fence for a long time, his hands trembling with suppressed anger and his mind racing through the implications of his neighbor's thinly veiled threats. Grace moved closer until her shoulder touched his arm, and he found himself leaning into her warmth the way he used to lean into Martha's presence when the world felt too complicated and demanding. "Don't worry, girl," he murmured, stroking her neck with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. "Nobody's going to take you away from here. We've both found something worth protecting, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let small-minded people destroy it because they're afraid of anything that doesn't fit their idea of what this place should look like." For the first time since Martha's death, Eli Cade felt the stirring of something stronger than grief, a fierce, protective instinct that had nothing to do with the past and everything to do with the future he was beginning to believe might still be possible. 2 months after Grace's arrival, the transformation was nothing short of remarkable, visible to anyone who'd seen her at the auction and could compare that broken creature to the animal that now grazed contentedly in Eli's pasture. Her coat had filled out to a lustrous grey-brown, with white markings around her muzzle and eyes that gave her an almost dignified appearance, as if good nutrition and gentle care had revealed the noble creature that had always existed beneath the neglect. The hollow look had vanished from her gaze, replaced by an alertness and curiosity that spoke of an animal who'd rediscovered her place in the world and learned to trust that her basic needs would be consistently met. Though her limp remained, would always remain, according to Dr. Rodriguez, she moved with confidence now, her injured leg no longer defining her relationship with her environment or limiting her ability to navigate the pasture and explore her surroundings. The transformation was more than physical. It was emotional and spiritual, the kind of healing that happened when a creature learned to believe again in the possibility of safety and care. The changes in Grace had sparked something in Eli that he'd thought was permanently dormant, awakening capacities and interests that had been buried under 2 years of grief and isolation. The old barn, which had sat empty and deteriorating since he'd sold the last of his cattle, suddenly seemed full of possibilities rather than memories of loss. He'd started with basic repairs, replacing rotted boards, securing loose hinges, cleaning decades of accumulated debris from the stalls where prize-winning cattle had once been housed and prepared for shows and sales. What had begun as simple maintenance for Grace's benefit had evolved into something approaching restoration, the kind of purposeful work that connected him to skills and satisfactions he'd forgotten he possessed. Working with his hands again felt like remembering a language he'd spoken fluently in another life, the rhythm of hammer and saw, and the gradual transformation of something broken into something whole, providing a kind of therapy that no counselor or medication could have offered. Each morning brought new projects that extended beyond mere necessity into the realm of craftsmanship and pride. Reinforcing the hayloft to proper structural standards, installing better drainage in the paddock area to prevent mud and standing water, rebuilding the feed room that mice had colonized during the barn's years of abandonment. The work was satisfying in ways that had nothing to do with monetary reward, and everything to do with the human need to create and improve and leave things better than you found them. It was during one of these renovation sessions, while he was replacing rotted floorboards in what had once been the tack room, that he met Lisa Chen, a third-year veterinary student from Colorado State who'd been volunteering with Dr. Rodriguez during her summer break from classes. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in a rattling Toyota pickup that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and held together by determination and prayers, her black hair pulled back in, a practical ponytail, and her jeans already bearing the stains of someone who worked with animals for a living rather than merely studying them from textbooks. "Dr. Rodriguez sent me to check on Grace," she announced, her voice carrying the efficient friendliness of someone comfortable in her own expertise and secure in her purpose. "He said you might benefit from some guidance about donkey behavior and psychology, and I could use the field experience for my large animal rotation." Lisa was perhaps 25, with the kind of easy confidence that came from growing up around animals and choosing to dedicate her life to their welfare rather than pursuing careers that promised greater financial reward but less personal satisfaction. She approached Grace with the unhurried movements of someone who understood that rushing any interaction with a formerly traumatized animal was counterproductive at best and potentially dangerous at worst. "She's beautiful," Lisa said, studying Grace's posture and movement with the trained eye of someone who could read animal body language like a written text. "Dr. Rodriguez told me about her condition when you first brought her home, the extent of the neglect and the emotional trauma she'd suffered. This kind of recovery doesn't happen by accident. You've done excellent work with her, the kind of patient, consistent care that makes all the difference between animals that survive and animals that truly heal." Eli felt a flush of pride that surprised him with its intensity and reminded him of feelings he'd thought were permanently buried with Martha and the life they'd built together. When had he stopped taking satisfaction in doing things well? When had competence become something he doubted rather than assumed? When had accomplishment become a memory instead of an ongoing possibility? Lisa spent the morning teaching Eli about donkey psychology, explaining concepts that Martha would have absorbed intuitively through years of experience, but which benefited from academic framework and scientific understanding. Donkeys, she explained, were prey animals with highly developed survival instincts, but they were also incredibly social creatures who formed deep emotional bonds with their human companions when those bonds were built on trust rather than dominance. "The key with Grace is understanding that she's not just physically healing, she's learning to trust again," Lisa said, watching as Grace allowed Eli to approach within arm's reach without showing signs of anxiety or defensive behavior. "Every positive interaction builds on the last one. You're not just feeding her body, you're feeding her spirit, teaching her that humans can be sources of comfort and safety rather than pain and fear." The breakthrough came on a Thursday afternoon in late July when the mountain air was sweet, with the scent of wildflowers, and the afternoon light had the golden quality that made everything look like it belonged in a painting. Eli was sitting on the ground in Grace's pasture, his back against the fence post, reading one of Martha's romance novels in the shade of the lean-to shelter, while Grace grazed nearby. It had become part of their routine, Eli reading aloud sometimes, just for the company of his own voice and the comfort of sharing Martha's favorite stories with another living creature who seemed to find his presence as soothing as he found hers. Grace had been grazing gradually closer over the course of the afternoon, working her way from the far side of the pasture until she stood perhaps 6 feet away, close enough that he could hear her breathing and see the way her ears swiveled to track sounds from the road and the mountains beyond. Without thinking about it, he extended his hand toward her, palm up, in the gesture that Martha had taught him decades ago for approaching nervous horses and other animals that needed to make their own decisions about contact. Grace looked at his hand for a long moment, her dark eyes studying his face as if trying to read his intentions, then took 2 careful steps forward and lowered her head to sniff his fingers with the delicate curiosity of an animal testing the boundaries of trust. When he didn't move suddenly or make demands for more contact than she was willing to give, she allowed his palm to touch her muzzle, the contact lasting perhaps 3 seconds before she stepped back to a more comfortable distance. But in those 3 seconds, something fundamental had shifted between them, a bridge of understanding that had been weeks in the building finally spanning the gap between human and animal, between hurt and healing. Trust, Eli realized, wasn't something you demanded or even earned through effort. It was something you received as a gift, precious precisely because it could never be taken by force or manipulation, only offered freely by a creature who decided you were worth the risk of vulnerability. From that day forward, Grace sought out his touch with increasing frequency, not constantly and never on demand, but regularly enough that Eli began to understand what Lisa had meant about emotional bonds and the deep connections that were possible between species when fear was replaced by mutual respect and affection. Grace would approach when he sat reading, allowing him to stroke her neck and scratch behind her ears in the spots that made her eyes half close with contentment. She followed him around the pasture when he worked, positioning herself where she could observe his activities while staying close enough for occasional contact and reassurance. The physical intimacy of caring for Grace had awakened something in Eli that extended beyond their relationship into other areas of his life that had been neglected during his years of grief and withdrawal. Walking past Martha's abandoned garden, one morning he noticed that the raised beds she'd built with such care and attention to drainage and soil composition were being overtaken by weeds and volunteer plants that had seeded themselves without human intention or guidance. The sight filled him with something that might have been guilt or might have been inspiration. He wasn't sure which, but either way, it demanded action rather than the passive acceptance that had characterized his response to most challenges over the past 2 years. Martha's garden had been her special domain, the place where she'd experimented with heirloom vegetables and unusual herbs, where she'd worked early in the morning and late in the evening when the heat of the summer days made outdoor labor unbearable. Martha's garden tools hung in the barn where she'd left them 2 years ago, their wooden handles worn smooth by her hands and darkened by the oils and moisture of thousands of hours of use, their metal surfaces bearing the patina of honest work and careful maintenance. The sight of them brought back memories so vivid they felt like physical presence. Martha in her wide-brimmed straw hat, humming while she worked, her hands dark with soil and her face bright with the satisfaction of coaxing life from the earth through knowledge and patience and sheer stubborn determination. He started small, clearing weeds from a single raised bed and working compost into soil that had gone fallow but still retained the structure and fertility that Martha's years of careful tending had built. The tomato plants she'd nurtured were long gone, victims of frost and neglect. But the perennial herbs had survived. Rosemary and sage, thyme and oregano, their aromatic leaves releasing familiar scents when he brushed against them. fragrances that brought back memories of meals shared and conversations that had lasted long into mountain evenings. Working among the herbs felt like a conversation with his wife, her knowledge flowing through his hands as he remembered lessons she'd taught him about soil and season, about the patience required to build fertility and the persistence needed to maintain what had been carefully created. Grace watched his gardening efforts with what appeared to be approval, sometimes approaching the garden fence to observe his progress and offer her silent companionship to work that felt both like mourning and like celebration. It was while he was working in the garden, transplanting tomato seedlings he'd started from seeds Martha had saved years earlier, that Sarah appeared, her rental car kicking up dust as it turned into the driveway with the purposeful speed of someone who'd made a decision and was determined to see it through regardless of consequences. Eli looked up from the plants he'd been carefully spacing according to Martha's detailed garden journal to see his daughter stepping out of a silver sedan that looked as out of place on the ranch as she did in her city clothes and carefully styled hair. Sarah had always been beautiful, but now she carried herself with the kind of polished confidence that came from urban success and professional achievement, a glossy competence that seemed designed to insulate her from the messiness and unpredictability of rural life. "Dad?" Sarah's voice carried surprise that bordered on shock, as if she'd arrived expecting to find him in the same state of deterioration and depression that had characterized their last visit, and instead discovered something she couldn't quite categorize or understand. "What are you doing?" Eli stood slowly, brushing soil from his hands and trying to see his activities through her eyes. The renovated barn with its fresh paint and repaired roof, the thriving garden with its neat rows of vegetables and herbs. Grace standing alert but relaxed in her pasture, like a picture of perfect animal husbandry. It all must have looked very different from the deteriorating ranch and defeated man she'd last seen at Martha's funeral 2 years earlier. "Hello, sweetheart. I wasn't expecting you." The words felt inadequate, insufficient to bridge the emotional distance that had grown between them or to explain the transformation that had taken place in her absence. Sarah approached the garden fence with the careful steps of someone navigating unfamiliar and potentially dangerous territory, her city shoes unsuited to the uneven ground and her expression uncertain about what she was witnessing. "I was in Grand Junction for a conference and thought I'd stop by. I tried calling, but..." She gestured helplessly at the scene before her, taking in the evidence of sustained effort and renewed purpose. "Dad, this place looks amazing. And you look different. Better. Like yourself again, only more so." He did feel different, though he wasn't sure he could articulate how or why the changes had occurred. Stronger, perhaps, in ways that had nothing to do with physical conditioning and everything to do with rediscovered purpose. More present in his own life, more connected to the daily rhythms and seasonal cycles that had once given his existence meaning and direction. Like someone who had reason to get up in the morning that extended beyond simple biological imperatives and social obligations. "Grace has been good for me," he said simply, the understatement carrying more weight than elaborate explanations could have conveyed. "Turns out, taking care of something else is easier than taking care of yourself. Gives you a reason to keep going, even when you don't particularly want to." Sarah's gaze moved from the garden to the barn, to Grace herself, taking in the evidence of sustained effort and careful attention that spoke of a man who'd found his way back to engagement with life and purpose. "She's beautiful," she said finally, her voice carrying genuine admiration rather than the polite interest she might have shown for something she didn't understand but felt obligated to acknowledge. "I expected, well, Betty made her sound like she was half dead and probably wouldn't survive the winter." "She was. When I found her," Eli admitted, remembering the broken creature from the auction barn and marveling at the transformation that patient care and consistent kindness had made possible. "But time and care work miracles if you're patient enough to see them through. Martha always said that most things could be fixed if you were willing to put in the work and didn't expect instant results." The mention of Martha's name hung in the air between them, carrying all the unresolved grief and complicated emotions that had driven them apart, rather than together in the aftermath of loss. Sarah had loved her mother deeply, but had also been frustrated by Martha's contentment with rural life and limited horizons, by her satisfaction with small-scale achievements and local recognition, rather than the broader success that Sarah herself had pursued and achieved. "How long are you staying?" Eli asked, genuinely uncertain whether he wanted her to leave quickly to preserve the peace he'd found, or to stay long enough for them to begin rebuilding the relationship that grief and geographical distance had damaged. "Just tonight, originally. I have to be back in Denver tomorrow for meetings that I can't reschedule." Sarah paused, looking around at the evidence of her father's renewal and seeming to weigh options she hadn't considered when she'd made the impulsive decision to visit. "But maybe I could stay longer if you'd like the company. My assistant could handle the meetings, and I haven't taken any real time off in months." For the first time in 2 years, Eli found himself genuinely wanting his daughter's presence, not because he needed taking care of or required supervision, but because he had something to share with her, something good and hopeful and worth celebrating. Grace had given him that gift. The recovery of himself as someone who had value to offer, experiences to share, wisdom to pass along to the next generation. "I'd like that," he said, meaning it more than he'd meant anything in years. "I'd like that very much. And I think Grace would enjoy meeting you properly, getting to know the daughter Martha talked about every day until she died." As if summoned by her name, Grace approached the fence line with the calm confidence she'd developed over months of healing, her dark eyes curious and alert as she studied this new human who'd entered her carefully ordered world. Sarah extended her hand the way Eli had taught her years ago with their horses, palm up and fingers relaxed, allowing the animal to make the first move toward contact. After a moment's consideration, Grace stepped close enough to allow Sarah's fingers to brush her muzzle, a gesture of acceptance that carried more weight than either human fully understood in that moment. "Hello, Grace," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying a gentleness that reminded Eli powerfully of Martha and the woman their daughter might have become if life had taken different turns. "Thank you for taking care of my dad when I couldn't figure out how to do it myself." In that moment, standing in Martha's garden with his daughter and the donkey who'd saved them both, Eli felt the first stirring of something he'd thought was gone forever, hope for a future that honored the past without being imprisoned by it, that built on loss rather than being destroyed by it.